Well, let's move to the edge room, and we'll start with those guys that we project in the starting lineup. The post-spring depth chart prediction that we had done had, and there's no surprises here, Derek Moore in one spot and Josiah Stewart in the other. We'll start with Josiah Stewart, who I don't want to say very quietly was one of Michigan's best pass rushers last year, but someone who I think because you had a Braden McGregor, because you had Jaylen Harold, because you had Derek Moore in that room, I think a lot of what Josiah Stewart did was a bit, I'll say, overlooked, and maybe that's just the fact that I haven't really thought about where he stood in the pecking order last year a ton since the season ended. But 23 solo tackles last year, 5.5 sacks. A guy who kind of when we think of Michigan edge rushers, oftentimes it's these guys who they're long, they're athletic, they're raw. They usually take some time to get up to speed. But Josiah Stewart, more of a squattier guy, 6'1", 245. Last year when we talked to him in the lead up to the season, he wanted to be kind of more of a fastball in Michigan's defensive line rotation. And I thought he acquitted himself extremely well, and actually kind of surprised by the in terms of national attention, because I've had a few weeks to kind of thumb through a lot of these national previews now. Don't really see him mentioned a ton as like a potential all Big Ten guy, but I certainly think he has a chance to be, one of the tone setters on this defense.
I agree, and he came back for a reason. I think he's going to be able to show more of his game. It's not surprising he was on the field for more passing downs than running plays last year, but it wasn't that wide of a split when you look at it. So he had 136 plays against the run, 177 as a pass rusher, and 36 in coverage. And that 36 in coverage is right up there with some of the highest among Michigan's edge rushers. They trust him to do a lot. So just having him as this versatile weapon up front is going to be important for Michigan this season, especially because I do feel like Wink Martindale is going to go with a little bit more or a little bit less of a structure in terms of position, where your nickel might be one guy on one play and another guy in another situation. And same thing could go with where you line up Josiah Stewart. So that's going to be kind of interesting to watch. But, he's fast. He's very physical, much more so than I think a lot of people expected coming in. And he's kind of the perfect complement to Derek Moore on the other side. Derek Moore being more of a big guy with the heavy hands, is very athletic as well. But Josiah Stewart, more of that speed rusher. So I just think that these two also have a lot to prove. I know we'll talk about D Moore in a second, but those two as a duo have a ton to prove because they showed a lot last year, but they were kind of in the shadow a little bit, as you mentioned. And now it's their show. And, maybe that speaks to some of the depth concerns behind them. But at the same time, it's a real opportunity for them to take control of what this defensive line is going to look like. We know what the interior is, and now it's going to be, can these guys get after the passer and set the edge? And I just think that, both of them can do both of those things.
Yeah, Stewart in particular, I think that both he and Derek Moore are going to be capable, because we know, and we've seen them do this or seen Michigan's edge guys do this in Mike McDonald's scheme. They've done it in Jesse Minter's scheme, but Wink does like to drop those guys back a little bit more. I think they're athletic enough to handle that. I think that, they'll be smart about it, though. I don't think they're just going to drop them back there or put them, ensure that they're on a tight, stuff like that. I think it'll be smart. They'll be used appropriately. Derek Moore is someone who I think it would be natural for a guy as highly recruited as he was to want to. It just seems like his freshman year, he could have. There were opportunities where he maybe could have been on the field more, but you had Mike Morris and you had the guys that we mentioned before, McGregor, Jaylen Harold. I actually give him a ton of credit in today's. We just know that everyone and everything has a price tag on it these days. And the fact that he has stuck around, the fact that he is someone who has a chance to be, as highly as I think of Josiah Stewart, the fact that Derek Moore is here, junior seasons, often when we see these guys make the biggest leap as a player, just in terms of rounding into something that approximates what their final form is going to be. if we're making a list of breakout guys on this entire roster, I think you could make a case that he could be somewhere in the top 3, top 4. It's interesting though, because so much of the storylines of that surround this football team have to do with guys that we're not really sure of, guys that we haven't seen a ton of. We've seen a lot of Derek Moore. The thing is, I think that we have a chance to see even more of him in a breakout sort of star-making turn this year.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think he can make a pretty big leap and become one of these next Michigan edge rushers that have gotten drafted. On the flip side of the coin, where you give him credit for sticking around, think about how much success Michigan edge rushers have had, not only in college, but going to the NFL. They've had 10 drafted just since 2017, which is crazy. I believe it's 10. Actually, it might be higher than that. So, yeah, it is higher than that. It's 11 with Jaylen Harold having gone this last season. As I do terrible math here on the podcast. That's why we're sports writers. I hate math. But he feels like, to me, one of the next guys in line and, to kind of take control of that position. And with the questions of what the rotation is going to look like behind Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart, I think he could be somebody who does push towards double-digit sacks, and same goes for Stewart as well. But Derek Moore against the run is really good too, and I think that's something that often gets overlooked with edge rushers because we look at pressures and we look at sacks, but especially in Michigan's defense, they put a lot on that front 4 and even really the front 7 in general. Sometimes it's 6 guys to stop the run with a light box, not putting a lot of resources in there. And even when they don't make the tackle, they have to destroy the blocks to free up the other guys to get the ball carrier down. So he does that really well. And that might be an underappreciated aspect of his game, but it's going to pay dividends if he's playing like that and Josiah Stewart takes a leap as well, plus what you have next to them. It's going to be an elite defensive line. It's going to be, something that you hang your hat on each game. Every single offense is going to have to prepare and account for each one of those guys. Who do you double? Who do you not? Who do you slide the protection towards? Who do you not? And I don't have those answers for you because I don't think there's a good one.
Yeah, the one thing that I find interesting about just maybe that starting 4 of Stewart, Moore, Grant, Graham is PFF kind of started the conversation. I think it was about a month or so ago. It was about this time last month where they put out a graphic of the guys that they have that Ohio State has coming back, the guys that Michigan has coming back. And JTT and Jack Sawyer are carrying a lot of weight there on said graphic. I wrote a story about it too. But this Michigan front has the ability to be, I think it could be the best in the Big Ten. I think it could be one of the best in all of college football. And that is so important for them, given that schematically things are going to look a bit different. But, forget about, all the people sort of having a hard time wrapping their minds around the idea that Wink Martindale might like to run a little more man defense, might like to do things a little more aggressively. And even he's addressed the fan base's comparisons to him and Don Brown. When you have a defensive line that's this good and this disruptive, and really when you think about it, this well-rounded too, they can stop the run. They can rush the passer. I think that there's probably even more pass rush upside there. That's going to take so much heat off of the back 2 levels of the defense. And when you have a linebacker room that, we'll talk about them in a future episode, that we think has a chance to be as good as it can. When you have Will Johnson back there on an island, when you've got some of the players they brought in via the portal. I mean, if that defensive line takes a step forward, and I think there's reason to believe they can, 3 of those guys are juniors. This is one of the best overall units in college football. And I don't think there's, even without that jump, I think they're that. So it's going to be a lot of fun to watch.
No doubt. And I think the one concern is the depth. If somebody goes down or if you need to bring in some others, then, and somebody is needing a blow in the middle of a game. They talked last year about those rally groups that were ready to go on the defensive line that would come in after 3, 4, 5 plays in a series. They'd rally, they'd do 3, 4 plays, and then that would kind of spell the guys who were in that possession would come back in. If you don't have as quality of players there, then it's not going to be potentially as good. But at the same time, sometimes when we make these comparisons to last year's group, we have to remind ourselves that that was a ridiculously deep and talented defense and team in general that went 15-0, and you're probably not going to go undefeated every year. So, at some point you have to just look at it for what it is, and it's really damn good. And obviously TJ Guy is probably the top name that we can talk about with providing depth. And Sharon Moore said that nobody, there were times during spring ball where, hey, nobody can block, or is anybody going to block TJ Guy today? I guess were his exact words. And that's a good thing to hear, because he's appeared in some of these games where he shows up late in the game and then he'll just be shot out of a cannon and make a sack. And you're like, wait, that's TJ Guy. That was 42. We haven't seen him all year. He comes in and looks good, and he's looked good in multiple spring games now. So I think it's his turn, and he's right in the mold of like a Mike Morris, who had to wait really until his senior season to have the role that he wanted. And then he goes on and, has a huge year. So I feel like is that comparison? I think he was mentored by Mike Morris as well, but do you agree with that comparison, that it just feels like, he may not be a starter this year? I wouldn't expect it, obviously, but it just feels like he's kind of next to have been maybe forgotten about for a year or two, but now he rises to a prominent role.
I think from that standpoint, the comparison works. Obviously, from a pure one-to-one play style, it's a little bit different, but the fact that, yeah. No, I know you weren't saying that. I can see that. And I can see him being a guy that, he could be sort of a guy that can be a dude. I see Guy as a guy that can be a dude. That's the most succinct expert analysis I can give on that. But no, I think he could be someone that maybe he has just like a big year and dips. I don't know about that. Obviously, I don't think he would have a 5th year of eligibility, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to look.
I think he does.
Like we saw him a bit. I'll workshop that here in a second, but I think he's clearly your number 3 edge. I think edge 4 is kind of where things get a little more interesting, and maybe they don't. Maybe edge 4 is a mishmash of different guys and different types of things. Maybe sometimes it's Eno Etta. Maybe sometimes it's Jay-Sean Barham as someone that they bring off the edge. Maybe sometimes it's, I don't know. I don't see, it seems like the last few, and like you said, it goes back to your questions about depth. The last few really good Michigan teams had 4 guys there. And this group does not have 4 guys. They have 2 for sure. We think they have a 3rd in TJ Guy. But, I would also say about him, like the fact that he hasn't seen the field also speaks to what has been ahead of him too. I think in a lot of other places,
exactly.
TJ Guy is probably on the field a lot 2 years ago. So I do think, when we talk about breakout guys, I think he fits the mold there as well.
Yeah. Just looking at it here, he does have a 5th year if he wants it. He redshirted in 2021. So this could be a 2-year push for TJ Guy. Maybe he's starting in a couple seasons, but him, I think Cam Brandt is going to be one to watch. I think he could break out. But like you said, it's like we just haven't seen him enough. But he's somebody that Mike Elston loved behind the scenes last year and played pretty well in games when he got in. So I think he could be somebody who really rises to the occasion. He's versatile. He can play standing up. He can play with his hand in the dirt too, as kind of that big end. And then there are other guys too. There are guys coming in this freshman class this summer that could impact, like a Baxter, Devin Baxter, but somebody we saw in the spring game who wasn't even as highly touted as him or Lugard. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name right now without having
Edekpaye.
Okay. I'll take you at your word there that's correct. But those 2 were the more highly touted ones. But then Dom Nichols in the spring game was somebody we spent probably 3 or 4 minutes talking about how good he looked late in that game as well. So I think based on what Lou Esposito has said and what some of the other coaches have said, and even the players, talking to Cam Brandt after the spring game, they're a little bit more impressed with what they have depth-wise at the edge position than they might have thought coming into spring ball. Again, it's one of the reasons why Eno Etta was able to move inside is because they have other options. But Dom Nichols, look for him. Like you said, I mean, you could piece things together. What if you move Jaysean Barham to edge in certain situations and you bring in a Jimmy Rolder in the middle? That could be a possibility. And, I mean, we couldn't get through this one. I know it's not linebackers yet, but without a Cole Sullivan mention, he looks like a guy that could play the edge as well. That might be his position down the road. Who knows? I know he's playing inside linebacker right now, but he seems like somebody that's too good to keep off the field and say, hey, or you could just tell him, hey, go get after the passer if you put him at the edge position. So bunch of different thoughts there, but there are names out there at the edge position, maybe more than any other spot on the field for Michigan, where people don't really even know who these guys are yet, and they could make an impact just because, Breon Ishmael is a guy you could also mention as well. Americ Kumba. I mean, guys that have not been talked about in the past. Like you said, it speaks to what was ahead of them. But now some of that production's gone, and there's an opportunity there. So it'll be interesting to see who takes some of those roles, because it could be, any number of guys.
Can't believe I almost went through a podcast talking about edge guys and not talking about Breon Ishmael, who I think is so fascinating. I mean, I think his senior year of high school, he weighed in like 215 or something. And then last summer, he showed up like 260. I forget what it was, but that guy's a freak. And that's maybe something to look at a year down the road, but maybe those guys factor into edge 4.
He was putting guys on their asses in the spring game. I'll tell you that.
It was outstanding. We had a lot of fun watching that.